Can I invite any comments, observations, or questions for Henrik and Owen on the papers?
No, I was first last time.
Amazing papers, thanks so much. And they're thinking about them together is making me think about the problematic historiography of supernaturalism and war, which you point out. This is this assumption that suddenly the burgeoning interest in spiritualism, but then that falls away, and we don't really tell the same stories about World War II, for example. So I wonder generally, Owen, for you, in terms of thinking about this project you're engaged in now, why is there such a sort of fetishized interest in the First World War alone as a site of what is called spiritualism, but as you point out is much more complex? What happens to that afterwards? And then I wonder if that might also, you have comments on then what happens to Crowley's wartime occulture in the Second World War, where he and Fortune and Gardner are talking about these kind of tactics against the Germans.
Yeah, I mean that one of the aims, after 5 years of public engagement in the First World War, one of the challenges is that people are utterly fixated on the language and symbolism of the First World War, the language we used about the fallen rather than people blown to bits on battlefields, the misnomers about, remember 85% of British soldiers actually came back from the battlefields. We have a very narrow view of this, and we've mythologized the First World War. We put into it a lot of perceptions about the nature of pacifism and warfare and honourable war and the whole mix. As you say, this is very British. You go to France or Germany, and it's the Second World War. It's not the first. It's not the First World War. Street names in France are the Second World War. They have war memorials, yes. In Germany, again, commemoration and stuff. First War. This is seen as a very British obsession on this one. But just to bring it forward, I mean, when you go into the 1920s and 1930s, yes, spiritualism does grow after the war. Theosophy does have a boom. Theosophy are really excited in the 1920s. Because they still think that it's going to happen. But by coming to the 30s, and it starts dipping again. But the interesting thing with Henrik's one is that they learn, so both German and British authorities learn, in particular, and American, learn from the propaganda techniques and understanding going on here. When you start looking at the way in which Goebbels very deliberately uses astrology, and he writes in his diaries, I think we'll bring up astrology again. That's a good way of hammering the British. They're obsessed with astrology. And in Britain, you've got the Mass Observation Survey, which is actually exploring all these things during the war. So yes, there is lots of astrology. They actually go and survey. The War Ministry surveys, has a popular survey and goes, is this astrology damaging popular morale? Goebbels picks up on this one as well. And you've got another example is Louis de Vol during the Second World War as an astrologer who again claims that he was a spy and writes a book about it, Secret Agent from the Sky, I think it's called. Very similar argument. There's no evidence that he was really involved. There's some tangential relationships where he goes and sees a few people, but he makes a big thing rather like Crowley. Oh, and I was a cultist astrologer, but I was working for the forces of good and stuff. So you do see some of the way in which there's a knowingness and a learning of it. And the Americans also in 1944-45 use astrology and things like phrenology, and they start talking about Asian leaders and saying we've looked at the stars of so-and-so, a Japanese puppet state. And, we can see from the occult here, when we've looked and we've had mediums in, that they're doomed, they're doomed, and they put it out through Hong Kong and things like that. So there is a learning of some of the propaganda stuff going on. But
Well, in terms of World War II, you could say that Crowley took a much more laid-back approach to World War II. The only action that we know of where we tried to get some sort of influence was when Rudolf Hess was captured.
Yeah.
That he offered himself to be part of the interrogation of Rudolf Hess, because there was this image of Rudolf Hess being an astrologer, and that Crowley could interview him and get the facts from him. But that never happened, of course. It's interesting also, I think, that when you read Crowley's private diaries, of course, he was quite old then, during World War II, but when you read his diaries, there's almost no mention of the war. He only, the people he's corresponding with, what he's been eating, the few sexual magic that he could still perform, and it's various literary enterprises and all, but very few references to the war, which says also something about that he wasn't interested in that to a certain extent.
This is a question for Owen. I have lots of questions, but I wondered, I think The one I want to ask is about the pull between the collective and the individual in the history that you're charting, because it struck me that, I guess, that one way of looking at these kind of occult, spiritualist, theosophist interventions might be seen as a way of kind of intervening actively in a world which seems kind of increasingly and terrifyingly out of control. But it struck me that there was kind of a kind of pull between collective intervention for something like, the societies that you were describing, where the power of thought might be used and kind of weaponized as a war, technology of warfare. But then also in the kind of, it seems to be that new thought suggests something quite different, right? Which seems to me to be more about kind of individual responsibility, like new thought as a kind of, like a technique of self-discipline, right? So if you discipline your thoughts carefully enough, you can intervene and control the world, the material world around you. And I just wondered whether, I don't know, whether you saw any kind of pull or conflict between, ideas of collective action and individual occult responsibility for
I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting sort of intersection there, and I think they do struggle with this to think about the individual and my personal faith, belief, relationship with X, and the war itself, which is collective. And I think you're right. You can see some expressions of this in various ways. So in theosophy, you see it in karma. Obviously, underpinning theosophy is the idea of karma, and karma is very much before the war, very much about personal karma and reincarnation. What happens in the war is that they now start applying karma to a whole nation. So they talk about the collective karma of Germany, and the ways in which that will have an influence afterwards. And you see in astrology, where you go from astrology, which is very personal, a horoscope is your personal destiny. And creepingly, some of the astrologers start talking about that they can look into the stars to see how a whole nation will happen. Now that's really stretching astrology from a scientific point of view. You say you can ascribe positions, you can draw up a horoscope for a nation. But that's exactly, I think those are expressions of that thing between the connection between the individual and those nature of those beliefs, and how can you make sense of something so global and so all-engrossing?
Yes.
You try and apply those individual sorts of ways of controlling, understanding the world onto a collective thing, how to just try and make sense of it. Yeah, there's an interesting sort of, not tension necessarily, but a further exploration of the occult and the hidden of a nation.
Any kind of collective possibility, but then, what comes down to an individual on a battlefield. Yeah, and that relationship between the two, your one little action and your death or otherwise on the battlefield is exactly. And they talk about, even British theosophists in the spirit of union and brotherhood, talk about how all those deaths of Germans will not be in vain because their karma will wipe out and cleanse the national bad karma of the state. So all the individual's personal karma will negate the collective karma of the evil Germans.
You mentioned different groups, like for example the Occultist Peace Union, and my question would be if any of these groups after the war claimed that they actually had an influence on what happened. Like, you also mentioned like Theosophists was ultimately about the black what were they called? The White Lodge.
Yeah, White Lodge and Black Lodge.
That was really what it was all about. Did any of these groups instrumentalize the war to further what they were doing?
Not so much. No, most of those attempts to influence in the small groups, like the Cultist Union or the Household of War League of Thought. They kind of fizzle. These little expressions of people wanting to do something out of bigger organisations at this time. But you get claims in the 1920s onwards, and you get those from the German occultist movement as well, and Rudolf Steiner and stuff. They're writing very much from a pan-German perspective, and you do get some reflections, but actually very little. It kind of just moves on very quickly in terms of there's not too much. Astrologers carry on saying, "Well, I predicted that." I mean, Crowley himself in 1914 said, "I talked to a spirit, and I predicted war." That was in 1915. Everyone in astrology and the predictive world and prophetic world is always claiming this after the fact. So you do get those sorts of things in the 1920s in astrological prophetic terms. But then quickly it moves on to the rumblings of the Second World War and the coming of the Second World. I think that's part of it. You know, the rumblings are already there come the late 1920s, and so the prophets and the occultists are already going, oh, hold on, we thought the end of this war was going to be the new thing, but oh no, there's something else is happening now, and things turn. But I don't know if you pick that up and some of the occult stuff coming out of Germany at this time as well.
Well, both. I mean, in the Thelemic tradition with Crowley, you could see that Crowley was definitely reading into history his own work, so that he would read, he would interpret the Book of the Law, which was his central text, into the events that were happening all around him. So for Crowley, the whole idea that we're going into a new age, a new aeon, is connected to war and strife and conflict, and they would read the First World War as a result of this. And also then the Second World War, you would say that also as a result of that we're moving into the new aeon of the crowned and conquering child. But the German Thelemites, the few that were, they were very ambivalent to what was happening during World War II. We have Martha Kunzel, for instance, who was one of the elder theosophists who turned into a Thelemite, who translated much of Crowley's work. She admired Hitler, and that became a problem with Crowley, because Crowley thought that Hitler was against democracy, and for Crowley, democracy is the only system that actually works, and is being threatened during World War II. And she saw Martha Kunzel saw Hitler as some sort of messiah. So so he had different understandings also at that time.
Thank you.
Maybe time for two more. Alan and Hannah, did you? Yeah.
So can I just say about the use of the N-word, that as a matter of cultural sensitivity, it's better not to use that word, even though it's in context, because it's something that can make a person of colour feel extremely uncomfortable to hear the word pronounced. It could be treated in different ways if you refer to it as the N-word.
You're absolutely right. You're right.
I just had a question about gender, actually, just drawing on the panels, the early panels from today. A question for Owen about gender and the occult in its wider sense in World War I, whether you saw any shift there in particular, given that we know that association between feminine in pre-war context and then war destabilising gender norms to the degree that it did, that it is essentially an assault on male bodies and minds and on normative masculinity itself. That do we see a significant shift, both in terms of the practice of the occult, but also in its ideas, because of that profound gender destabilisation?
I mean, there's clearly stuff, as you say, from our previous talks and stuff that Henrik's been talking about in terms of a cultural, literary sphere. I think there's things going on. I mean, I'm particularly interested in a kind of a popular culture and the gender aspects of what war does. And you don't see it, I don't really detect it so much within those occult organisations or spiritualism. Obviously, there are very strong female leaders in theosophy, and to a lesser degree in terms of leading spiritualists. But of course, a lot of the mediums, most of the mediums are female, and most of the fortune tellers are female. So the interesting thing for me in terms of the gender dynamics of the war is the degree to which, and there is a boom in fortune telling. I mean, fortune telling is popular beforehand, but fortune telling, you get quite a lot of. I've been through dozens and dozens and dozens of court cases, and they're nearly all female, and they talk about the ways in which they, as a female, are trying to cope with the war. And often it's my husband's gone around trying to make a bit of money, so I tell the cards and things like that. And these are backstreet fortune tellers, charging sixpence for a reading and stuff. But when you look at the police reports and stuff like this, we got 30 women a night. Most women are going to these, so you get this whole. There was a culture beforehand of women going to fortune tellers, and the idea that men were reluctant to because that was superstitious, and it's only women. My wife goes off to fortune tellers again. You get it in court cases. She was off to the fortune teller, so I gave her a slap. In assault cases or whatever. I'm fed up with her going to the fortune teller. She's spending all the money I'd rather spend on drink, etc., etc. So you do get this quite strong cult, what you might call divinatory female culture taking place. And a few oral histories that have been done with women who were then growing up during the war and just after do talk about the idea that we would never say we were going to the fortune tellers during the war or just after. Our menfolk wouldn't tell our husband because it would be our own thing, and we would go off together and we would go and see it. So it becomes a very, I think, in those war conditions in particular, that sense of a close-knit female, almost company, but also that looking up to another woman who had knowledge, divinatory knowledge, whether it's through mediumship or through various other techniques like card reading or whatever. So I think there's more work to be done there.
So you don't see a resurgence of interest in spiritualism by men who've experienced intervention necessarily?
Well, again, there's been overinflated spiritualism. Again, over and over again, when you see what they go to. There's a lot of mediums are playing hard and fast with their reputations during the war. Simple as that. And they may be actually. There's one court case with Annie Britton who was recommended 100 times by Arthur Conan Doyle and Oliver Lodge. They go, go to Annie Britton. She was a potteries one. When you look at the court cases, what's she doing? She's using. She's not using spiritualism to talk to spirits. She's using various forms of psychotelepathy. And so she's a medium in one context in a spiritualist church, but what she's actually practicing as a profession is another thing. But what it says is that there aren't, I think, perhaps the broad pertinent to your point is that we need to get away from the idea that all these daughters and mothers of those at the front are somehow flooding to spiritualists to communicate with their sons. It's not happening. It happens a bit with mass sort of spiritualist seances in London in the 1920s, 1930s, but it's not happening in the war. So we have a misunderstanding, I think, of that.
Can I just thank both of our speakers again? That was wonderful.